Okay. Yeah, welcome to our, may I have the slides, please? Thanks. Welcome to our webinar, IPA webinar, Transcultural Psychoanalysis on the Road to the Lisbon Congress. We will spend 90 minutes together. And please, next slide. I have to present myself. My name is Ursula Burkhardt. I'm a psychoanalyst from Cologne, Germany, and I will moderate this session. Next slide, please. We will, after some instructions I have to give you, we will listen for 15 minutes to a presentation of Dr. Tomas Plaenkers. After that, I will discuss with him for about 15 minutes, and then there will be an open discussion for the audience with Tomas Plaenkers. And yes, this is the questions and answers. You may submit your questions and answers, your questions in the question and answer section. I hope you can find it in the bottom part of your screen. You have to click and then write it in there. And in case you want to use the English subtitles, we will speak English, but sometimes it's helpful to have the English subtitles. Please press the button CC at the bottom of the toolbar. Missing something? Okay. Please remember that this webinar will be recorded and that it will be uploaded on the IPA webpage and on YouTube. And you as a participants will be sent a link to the recording in the days following the webinar. I think it will take 4 or 5 days. And yes, just a repetition, but you are able only to interact via the Q&A button, and you are not able to send chat messages or use the microphone. So I will now introduce Tomas Plaenkers to you. Tomas Plaenkers is Training and Supervising Analyst and Psychologist at the Frankfurt Psychoanalytical Institute. From 1985 to 2016, he was research scholar at the Sigmund Freud Institute in Frankfurt, and he's now working in private practice. He was former consultant member of the IPA China Committee and training analyst there. As a European representative, he had been a member of the IPA Committee planning a 4th IPA region in the Asia-Pacific region. From 2000 until 2005, he participated in a psychotherapeutic training in China for psychologists and medical doctors in Shanghai. Since then, he is involved in the training of the first Chinese psychoanalysts organized by IPA in China. As a result of a research project in China, he has edited and published a book in German and English on the transgenerational consequences of the Chinese Cultural Revolution under the title Landscapes of the Chinese Soul, the Enduring Presence of the Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1976. It was published at Karnak. In 2022, he completed a project on the German-Chinese translation of the Freud lectures, which has now been published online on the IPA website. And there are also publications on many clinical and social psychological topics he made. So please, Thomas, you may start with your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Ursula, for this kind introduction. And I also want to welcome everybody to this webinar. and I will give a short introduction for about 15 minutes on the topic of transcultural psychoanalysis. So let me have a look. I want to share my screen with you so you can read the text. To speak of transcultural psychoanalysis is actually a pleonasm, a kind of a wide mode. For every analysis with our patients is an encounter between different cultures. Every analyst and every patient embodies an individual culture of feeling, thinking, and acting. To speak of transcultural psychoanalysis as psychoanalysis abroad or on another continent ignores the foreigners of cultural encounters in our own consulting room. One could say that psychoanalysis is always transcultural, or it's not psychoanalysis. This is of great importance in terms of treatment. This individual concept is contrasted with a social concept of culture that refers to groups, large groups, and nations. And this is what we usually mean when we talk about psychoanalysis in other cultures. We then assume two things. On the one hand, an essential core of psychoanalysis that, despite all cultural differences, still allows it to be recognized as psychoanalysis. On the other hand, different cultures that differ in their central mechanisms from the Jewish European cultural context in which psychoanalysis originated. Both individual and social culture have a defensive function against influences that disturb the respective equilibrium. Culture is therefore not only something that shapes the individual, a society, or even psychoanalysis, but is also the subject of critical psychoanalysis. Unfortunately, I won't be able to go into this point further today due to time constraints. In order not to get lost in too many details, I will focus on three levels of culture: language, the philosophical background, and mythology. In the following, I will compile selected aspects from these three levels related to psychoanalysis in China for our subsequent discussion. Since I've been teaching psychoanalysis in China since 2000, I have repeatedly had to grapple with the question of whether psychoanalysis is even possible in China. Are the local ideas of social harmony, of the primacy of the collective and family over the individual, or the conception of the ego as a we, not contrary to psychoanalytic conceptions of the ego, individuality, and self-enlightenment? Today I would like to address some of these contradictions or supposed contradictions using China as an example, and in doing so, also raise the question of how psychoanalysis can be enriched by the foreign. So, first, language. If language is the net in which we capture reality, then differently structured languages determine a different relationship to reality. Ludwig Wittgenstein famously said, "The limits of my language are the limits of my world." Cultural ways of life define different language games that are then directly dependent on our external and internalized relationships with objects. The profound differences between European and Asian cultures, to put it simply, can also be described as differences in these linguistic networks, since each culture creates specific perceptions and thus linguistic realities. This difference between the German and Chinese languages is most evident in the dissimilarity of their writing systems. Chinese writing differs significantly from ours in its completely different speaker-object relationship, as well as in the different relationship between signs and language. Our alphabetical writing consists of a system of differential signs which, in their spelling, no longer refer to a designating object, but replace it with the speaker's language. Our writing is therefore phonetic, in contrast to Chinese, which is object-centered. The relationship between speaker and object thus takes on an interesting and different weighting. The meaning of a Chinese character is usually derived from the context in which it is used or to which it refers. Thus, the function of the word I doesn't correspond to that of I in Indo-European languages. A statement is complete even without the subject I. Nor is the third person differentiated. Ta means he, she, it. When talking about a third person, the listener doesn't know the gender. This is a quote from Deadban in 2011. The intended meaning is then revealed by the context. Against this background, our attempt to translate Freud's introductory lectures on psychoanalysis from German into Chinese required a great deal of work and time. Previously, these lectures had been translated from English into Chinese, as had some other works by Freud and more recent psychoanalytical texts. There are various reasons for this. On the one hand, English has developed internationally as a lingua franca. On the other hand, the simpler grammatical structure of English is more suited to the Chinese language. And it's also the English language that is used by all Western psychoanalysts in seminars in China. Communication generally works well here, and Chinese colleagues are able to absorb and understand psychoanalytic content easily. This is particularly evident in case study seminars and supervision sessions, where a psychodynamic understanding of patients, transference and countertransference, as well as treatment considerations, can be communicated effectively in both directions. The close connection between language and inner object relations became even clearer to me in these seminars when the participants discussed among themselves in Chinese, which was much more lively than the English discussion. Second, Chinese philosophy. The American philosopher Thomas assumes that every idea that exists somewhere in the world can also be found everywhere else in the world. This allows us to think of Western and Eastern thinking less as opposites and more as different manifestations of fundamentally similar or identical ideas. Let's consider the three essential spiritual teachings of China from this perspective: Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. How do they relate to the Western concept of the individual and the psychoanalytical goal of self-development through insight and integration of the unconscious parts of the self? First, we are confronted with the Chinese concept of self-cultivation, which certainly includes the concept of self-development that is familiar to us. But what is the goal of self-cultivation in China? According to Lin Tao, the first Chinese IPA analyst, Confucianism strives for faithfulness and forbearance in order to create social and individual harmony. Taoism, on the other hand, aims at non-action, at not following impulses in order to immerse oneself in the natural flow of things, thus creating natural harmony. Similarly, Buddhism aims at creating inner emptiness in order to cultivate one's true nature. Even though Buddhism describes the world we perceive as the named world, in contrast to the world it considers to be real, and therefore seeks self-discovery in a turning away from the outside world, it doesn't aim at an understanding of the psyche as differentiated within itself with different degrees of consciousness and conflicts, as expressed in psychoanalysis with the iceberg model for its horse rider metaphor, the defense mechanism theory, or the theory of ego splitting. Psychoanalysis focuses on the self-concealment of human beings, which is why its clinical practice is a research endeavor. In contrast, in the great Chinese spiritual traditions, the inner world is not an object of research, but rather the subject of moral and educational appeals, which is why sinologists also speak of a moral philosophy. This explains the high status of the moral person in everyday Chinese life, who, thanks to a well-established inner moral authority, is able to take a stand against the collective and thus behave individually. But does this mean that Chinese people can't use the psychoanalytic method for themselves? The opposite is true. The distinction between the external world and a hidden real world found in Chinese moral philosophies also makes Chinese people receptive to Western psychology, such as psychoanalysis, which differentiates between the conscious and unconscious inner world. The fact that this is not just a theoretical postulate is demonstrated by the clinical practice of high-frequency, long-term analysis, which is now spreading successfully in China. Chinese people also have to come to terms with universal and essential facts of life, as formulated by Manicure, and give them a psychological form. Dependence on the breast as the highest good, the parental relationship as a creative act, and the inevitability of time or the recognition of death. However, the meaning that individuals attach to these universal facts of life can only be understood within their unique, distinctive personality and within their specific cultural context, in the West as in the East. They are imbued with personal interpretation and meaning. Different cultures can therefore be compared in terms of the forms they provide for coping with these facts of life. Third, mythology. If we consider mythological narratives, the childhood memories that a nation preserves, as Freud calls them, as relationship stories, they are interesting from a psychoanalytic perspective in terms of family and psychological conflicts. In particular, the question is whether even a very different culture, such as the Chinese, has the Oedipus complex as a central psychological conflict. I will address this in my lecture in Lisbon this summer. Let me just mention one Chinese myth that demonstrates a different but ultimately also Oedipal conflict structure. This is the story of the Weaver Goddess. The Weaver Goddess, the daughter of the heavenly Queen Mother, used to descend from her heavenly court and bath in a lake that was on this spot. A young buffalo shepherd lived by the lake. He watched the goddess, and the two fell in love. They marry and have a son and a daughter. But the heavenly Queen Mother envied their happiness. She sends some gods down and lets the Weaver Goddess kidnap her. The buffalo boy pursues her. When he almost catches up with the kidnappers, the heavenly Queen Mother pulls a hairpin out of her hair and digs a wide river between the kidnappers and their pursuer. The Silver River separates the couple forever. Only once a year, on the 7th day of the 7th moon, the magpies fly in from all over China and form a bridge, and then the family is reunited for a short time. This story can be interpreted in several ways. I would like to focus here on one central theme: the mother's attack on her daughter and her relationship with a man, motivated by envy. In this, as in other Chinese myths, the Oedipal attack doesn't come from the child towards the parents, as we understand it in the West, but often the other way around, from the parents towards the child. In a Confucian society, questioning or attacking paternal authority is almost taboo. Confucian piety, obedience, and submission to parental authority give the opposite direction to aggression between generations or inner object relations in the myth, just as quoted as well in other Chinese myths. But even under these circumstances, we are dealing with an intergenerational conflict in a triangular constellation. As is perhaps evident from these areas of Chinese language, philosophy, and mythology, which I have unfortunately only touched upon briefly here, I see no fundamental obstacles to an appropriate reception of psychoanalysis. On the contrary, I believe that Chinese thinking in context, both on a linguistic and social level, enriches psychoanalysis and is particularly conducive to the British development of object relation theories. Against this background, our ideal of the self-reliant individual can be critically questioned. Much more needs to be said on this subject, but perhaps this is a sufficient starting point for our discussion today. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Thomas, for this really rich and inspiring presentation, and I'm sure that we will have an interesting discussion now. Maybe let's start with one first question. As you spoke mainly about theoretical points until now, I would be interested to hear about your clinical experiences in China, because you have many years of them.
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. It's a very big question, so I only can select
some time.
Aspects. So I would begin with a basic topic, and this is when we in Europe or in other countries in the world talk about China, we at once have a view of China like a nation or a country in Europe or in South America or Africa or North America. So, and this is a basic failure, because China really is a continent, and it's not only the amount of people that are living there, 1.4 billion people, but it's also the huge space of this country. So no one would talk about Europeans as such a united country, because we know that the people in Northern Europe are very different from the people in Southern Europe. And even in our country, in Germany, the people in Northern Germany are different from the people in Southern Germany. So we are aware of these cultural differences. And the same applies to China. So people in Northern China sometimes can't understand people in Southern China, because they have different accents. And what is the common ground for understanding is the writing system. So, and this is the same with the character of the people. So people have, dependent from the province they live, they often have different characters. So some are more closed and distant, and some are more open. So it's very difficult to speak of the Chinese patient or the Chinese character. So also the mythological and philosophical aspects I have mentioned are very generalized aspects. And in the very concrete patient you have in the consulting room in China, everything can be different. Of course, there are some general lines, as I mentioned with the Confucian ideology. So I will come back to this later. When I started teaching in China, I had a lot of doubts whether psychoanalysis really can be applied and taken up from the people there. And I was very much surprised that the basic psychoanalytic concepts like thinking about the conscious and the unconscious, or thinking in terms of defense and different defense mechanisms and so on, that could be grasped by the audience there. And what even more convinced me was when we had case discussions. So in the case discussions, or in the cases the participants presented, I could see that they took in the psychoanalytic ideas and that they were able to deal with it in a beneficial way for themselves and also for the patients. So this really convinced me more than any theoretical thoughts that psychoanalysis can be developed in China, and it is developing now. So now today we have a Chinese study group, and it has already 18 IPA analysts in China. So and every year when there is this meeting of the Asia Pacific psychoanalytic groups, also participants from China take part, and they engage in these psychoanalytic discussions of theoretical terms and of clinical terms and so on. So this was a learning experience for me in China.
Great. I would like to ask, it is in a connection with what you said, how you dealt with the language, with the different language structures and between German, English, Chinese.
Yeah. Well, all the Western psychotherapists, not only psychoanalysts, but also family therapists, group therapists, system therapists, behavior therapists, and so on, they all teach in English in China. And English is the link, the common link between the Chinese and the Westerners. And on a theoretical level, I think this is not so much a problem because even if you read psychoanalytic texts or have psychoanalytic seminars in your mother tongue, candidates in training have to learn to fill the theoretical terms with clinical experience. So this was my experience when I was in training. So I read a lot of psychoanalytic literature, but it didn't take a hold in me until I had clinical experience that I could connect with these terms. And I think this is the crucial point. So when we teach in English, the most important thing is that the participants in China or in other Asian cultures, that they slowly can connect these theoretical considerations with clinical facts. And this takes time. And in the training, it is important that they have sufficient self-experience. So I had a very good experience with IPA candidates who have training analysis proper 4 times a week, or when they have shuttle analysis, they do it sometimes in person with their training analysts, or sometimes online. And this rich self-experience helps them really to grasp theoretical terms of psychoanalysis step by step. And when we have a clinical discussion, I feel, with these IPA candidates, it's easier to discuss clinical facts than with psychotherapy candidates who only have a small self-experience and not so rich like the psychoanalytic candidates. So it's always the problem of filling these theoretical terms with clinical experience. The other point is when, and this is what Westerners do when they have Chinese in training analysis, they most times speak English with them. There are only a few who have Chinese language capabilities. And so they have to do both, have to do psychoanalysis most times, if they are not from Britain, most times they have both don't speak in their mother tongue. And this is a difficulty for the analyst as well as for the patient. So, but this is the way psychoanalysis also started when it originated from Vienna and came to other European countries, to France and to Britain, and then North America, South America, and so on. So, and I'm sure it will take the same way in China. So we now have, as I already mentioned, 18 Chinese IPA analysts, and they now do psychoanalysis in Chinese with their Chinese analysis. And so things will develop. And I think the crucial focus all the time is the clinical experience, and to connect them with the theoretical terms.
So now development in China, the development of psychoanalysis in China will be faster. So through psychoanalysts who are there, training analysts who are there.
Yeah, I'm a little bit reluctant to use the term faster because
more dynamic, maybe.
Yeah, more dynamic, and it slowly takes more space and has more participants. So the interest in psychoanalysis in China is high. So it's a big interest, and there is a lot of translated literature today in China. This is no question. But when you consider the amount of people who are there, the relationship to these very, very few analysts, it's like a drop of water in the sea. But so it starts.
Okay. Thank you. I think we should come to the questions of the audience. I think. Mariano, could you maybe send a question?
Yes.
Okay, so our first one. When you said pleonasm is a white mold, I associated to the criticism of whiteness as an identity that colonizes and oppresses other cultures. Psychoanalysis originates in a white culture. Can you comment on how we become transcultural?
Yeah. A big question and a difficult question.
Yeah.
So I think implicit in this question is whether psychoanalysis or the central theoretical topics of psychoanalysis, whether these topics are only applicable to Western cultures and whether they are foreign, for instance, to Chinese people or people in other countries. This is a topic I will discuss in my Lisbon paper in respect to the Oedipus complex. So my personal view is that it's the genius of Freud that he discovered universal facts of life and mechanisms of the psyche that can be applied all over the world to everyone. The topic of colonialism, I think, refers to the prejudices we have from the West for the, let's say, for the Chinese or for the African people or other people in other countries. And the same we can find also with Eastern people who have their prejudices in respect to the Western people. So, for instance, in the West, we often have the idea that Chinese people have no concept of individuality, and they are group orientated and family people. And the Chinese often have the idea that the Westerners are very much individual. There is some truth in this, but it's also wrong when you really have personal contact with the respected people. So in the consulting room, a Chinese patient also shows his individuality. And they also have their individual feelings and fantasies and so on. And in our Western consulting rooms, we also can find that our patients have strong family connections and group connections, and that their individuality can be questioned. So we really have to question our prejudices we have in order to have an easier view of the world. But this is not true in reality. So the more I think we interact all over the world, and the new technical means allow this to have these worldwide connections, the more we have to learn what we have in common and what is really different. So I think we more and more, and maybe I'm too optimistic, but I think we more and more come away from these simple colonistic views of the other. And of course, it's a question of anxiety. So I only can allow myself to become acquainted with what is lying to us and what we don't know if I have not too much anxiety for this. And this is what we unfortunately can observe now nearly in all, for instance, in all Western world countries, that people are more and more hostile against people from abroad. And that's why the right-wing parties became stronger. Because it's a question of anxiety when they meet people from abroad who have different opinions, different habits of life, and so on. One must have the capability of open oneself to these foreign habits.
Is it necessary to meet personally in order to overcome projections, for example?
I think to meet personally is the best way. But of course, you also can go into the literature, you can look to movies, you can go to cultural events and so on. All this is possible today with the new technical means we have and which connect us all over the world, like this webinar here.
Okay, thanks. We have another question. How did you become interested in pursuing psychoanalysis in China? How did you deal with the language differences?
This is a good question.
So,
when I was a student, we had in Germany the students' movement. And at that time, I and many of my my friends, we were more left-wing orientated, and we were full of admiration for the message from China about the Cultural Revolution. And we really admired Mao Zedong for sending physicians to the countryside and to help the people there and so on. So we had a totally idealistic view of what was happening in China. And of course, we could maintain this idealistic view because our source of information was very limited. So this was my background when in the year 2000, Alf Gerlach, who is one of our most active German colleagues in China, asked me whether I would like to take part in teaching in China. And I thought, well, I will go there once and I will look how it feels to do that, be there. And I went there, and very quickly I was so fascinated by this culture and the people there, which welcomed us so heartily, that I decided to go there again and again and again. And this I observed also with my colleagues. So jokingly, we sometimes spoke of the China virus, so that we all got, because it's really a very enriching experience, staying there, having these clinical discussions with the Chinese, which allow you a more closer look to the way the people think and feel and how they deal with each other in the family system and within friends and so on, much more than you can gain as tourists when you are there. So I'm very grateful for my Chinese colleagues to had opened the door for these insights and acquaintance. The language differences, as I already mentioned, we try to overcome by English, and some of us learned a little bit Chinese, but this doesn't allow me, for instance, to communicate with the people. Maybe sometimes it's helpful in the restaurant to order some food, but not for really a dialogue in Chinese.
Thanks. I think we have another question. Why do you prefer the term transcultural instead of intercultural for naming the encounter of psychoanalysis with other cultural references than Western society?
Well, I think this has to do with the origin of psychoanalysis. The origin of psychoanalysis is in Middle Europe, and it's went from there to other cultures. Intercultural, I would think, is something that goes between the cultures to and fro. And this is not the way with psychoanalysis. When it is coming to a country like China or Africa, intercultural is now more developing within the IPA when we exchange cultural discussions between analysts who are already working in other countries and continents. So this is really an enriching experience to listen to Japanese or Indian colleagues who talk about their clinical view from a psychoanalytic point of view. This is more intercultural, but bringing psychoanalysis now to China in the very beginning is more a transcultural endeavor. Yeah.
Thanks. Fourth question. I was wondering whether there is such a thing as undergoing analysis with a language other than your mother tongue. Could it be named as psychoanalysis?
I personally wish every patient to have analysis in his mother tongue, in his or her mother tongue. And you are right pointing out that speaking in a foreign language creates really difficulties in grasping the right terms for one's feelings and fantasies and for the exchange with the analyst. But I want to point out that even in our mother tongue, we have certain difficulties. So some patients really have difficulties to develop a proper language for their internal life. And that's why I remember a paper of a German colleague called Finding the Right Words for What's Going On. So even if you have analysis in your mother tongue, sometimes the language for feelings and fantasies that are more pre or unconscious is like finding a foreign language, a new language. So, and this is, I thank you very much for this question. I think language is really in the very heart of every psychoanalysis. But even if you speak in a foreign language, I would call this psychoanalysis, and it's a work. You have to work to develop a proper language for what's going on.
Thank you. Fifth question is, I was wondering how the fact that Chinese is not alphabetical impact the mind of the analysand.
I must confess, I can't answer this question. But the question is very interesting, and I think it could be the basis of a research project. So what I mentioned, that the Chinese writing is more object-oriented, can be found also in Confucianism ideology, which orients the person to the social surrounding and has the idea that a well self-cultivated personality is in balance with the social surrounding. So this object view is very much in the heart of the Confucian mentality. And it's very interesting that this meets with the object theory of psychoanalysis. And we all learn that our internal life is built up by object experiences, which are internalized. And these internal objects have a life in their own, they interact also. So that's why Donald Meltzer is saying we are living in two worlds, in an external world and an internal world, but both worlds are worlds of object interactions. So that's why I think that for Chinese, thinking in terms of object relations, theoretically and in the clinical space, might be easier to grasp than for Westerners who have a more individualistic or sometimes narcissistic look for themselves. But I say this very cautiously, and I think it needs really deeper research.
I have another question. Is psychoanalysis practiced in the highly advanced technological environment of China or the more traditional sectors of society? It appears that there is a dichotomy with the cultural sphere of China. It appears that there is a dichotomy within the cultural sphere of China. The technological and the traditional.
I think this question connects to what I already mentioned, that China is really a continent with very different areas of life. And every tourist who comes to China, when he starts to travel in Shanghai or in Beijing, in these mega cities, really is very much impressed by a high technology that is much higher than, for instance, what we are used in Germany. And the people there who come to psychoanalysis in these mega cities, they often have international experiences. They stayed for sometimes in the US or in Europe to study. They often speak fluently English, and so they have international experiences, and so they become interested in psychoanalysis. And of course, this is quite different to the countryside. And in the countryside, their psychoanalysis doesn't exist. And it's a little bit the same problem we have in the Western world. So analysts in the Western world also stay in the big cities and not in the countryside, normally. So there are some exceptions, but so in China, China is a country that is coming away or is departing from strict Confucian and Buddhistic and Taoistic mentality towards a Western mentality. So I know from my clinical experience in China that you can observe now conflicts in the consulting room that are more or less the same like in Western consulting rooms, very hysterical. Very much women who are very much centered around the father, and also with murderous impulses against the father, which is in total contradiction to the Confucian ideology, where you never should contradict your father. So you can find everything in China now because the mentality of the people changes with growing capitalism in this country. And the same contradictions I think you have also in other Asian countries, which have these both ways of life, the traditional one and the Western one.
Next one. What is the governmental line to psychoanalysis in China? Is it accepted or is it not yet seen?
It is accepted. And it is even supported. We must be aware that in such a big country like China, there are huge psychiatric hospitals which are full of patients which are mostly treated with psychopharmacological drugs. And there is a huge need for psychotherapy. So this is one point. The other point is that in the last decades, the number of suicide in schools and universities raised according to the strong pressure that was that existed for the pupils and the students in the connection of the one-child policy. So even when students had only not very bad marks, but in the middle range achievements, they felt depression. So the Chinese government invested a lot of money to install counseling centers at schools and in universities all over the country. And psychologists are working there. And of course, these psychologists need training. And that's why the courses of psychoanalysts in China are asked for very much. So there is an open door for psychoanalysis from the government, and so I also could experience this once when I was part of a governmental delegation traveling through China, and with our Minister of Science from our German province of Hessen. And we have been welcome everywhere. So the official line is very friendly. Yeah. But I think maybe this is also due to a view of psychoanalysis as just a clinical therapeutic method. And as long as you limit it to this, the doors are open.
Another one. What do you think, what does the analyst of psychoanalysis find in Asia? That means China, Japan, India, Korea, Taiwan. What psychoanalysis misses in Europe or America?
My personal experience is that, and I had experiences in Japan and in India and China, that the attention that is paid for the people in their exchange in these Asian countries is more developed and cautious than in our Western world. So compared with my experiences here in Europe, and maybe also in Europe we have differences. The people exchange in a different way, for instance, in Germany and in Britain. And so in Germany, I think compared with these Asian experiences, the interactions are more direct, sometimes more aggressive, and not so empathetic. While in the Asian countries, I found that the interactions are more object-centered, that they try to agree with you, even if they don't agree, and try to develop a harmonious relationship. And of course, we have our psychoanalytic critical ideas to this, and we think in terms of defense of aggression and anxiety of aggression and so on. But nevertheless, it doesn't fail to create a very warm feeling when you are traveling there and when you meet the people. So more or less, it's very pleasant, even if it's a defense.
Mm-hmm.
So of course, even in Germany, we have, or in the Western world, we have patients who are very inhibited in unfolding their aggressive fantasies and feelings. And we have to work on this in our usually psychoanalytic world, way. And the same you have to do in China with the patients there. So sometimes you can find in the Western world patients who are more Chinese than a Chinese patient in China in terms of inhibition. So we have to differentiate between a more general view and the individual view in our consulting rooms.
Have you perhaps experienced that there are specific defense mechanisms in China that differ from the defense mechanisms in Western countries?
Very cautiously, and in the individual case, this might be very different. One could say that Chinese patients try more than Western patients to agree with their analysts and to create these confusion, harmonic relationship. And the Western patients are more experienced in uttering their very individual feelings and fantasies. But this is a very general view.
Mm.
In the single case in the consulting room, it can be quite the opposite. In China as well as in the Western world. So I would like to skip all these general prejudices, which are not really helpful if you are have these meetings in the consulting room. I think the best is really to be curious, to find out what internal culture is my patient connected to, and how does it function, and how does it work, and how is the difference to my culture, my internal culture. And this really would be intercultural and not transcultural. Yeah.
A long question. You have been committed to the exchange of IPA groups in the Asia-Pacific region. How do you think your German or European background has contributed to the exchange between groups in the Asia-Pacific region and to the development of the Asia-Pacific region as the fourth region?
Oui. I can't disconnect my European or German background from the fact that I'm a psychoanalyst. And this psychoanalytic background allowed me to question my prejudices and to have a closer look to my fantasies when meeting people from the Asia-Pacific region. And that's why I tried to have an open look in meeting the colleagues and also participants of the seminars and even patients there. And that's why I think to have this more open attitude, which I learned from my psychoanalytic training, allows me to have this curiosity when I come into touch with some aligned opinions and attitudes. But I would deny that there is a specific that there is something specific in the European background that is helpful for meeting in the Asia-Pacific region the colleagues, because this is also in the area of very general statements, and the European in the single case does not exist as the Asian in the single case. So I think it's what is much more important is the individual curiosity and taking time to get to know the foreignness of the other one.
Next question. You've summed up a Chinese myth illustrating the Oedipal conflict from the mother towards her daughter bound to a man. In the West, we consider more the conflict as starting from the child towards his parents. Can you explain more about the cultural origin of these different approaches in China and Western? Did it, I think.
Yeah, I think this is closely connected to the development of the idea of being an individual in the Western world, originated from the Greece philosophy, and it's not by chance that Freud took the Oedipus conflict and the name of the Oedipus conflict and the story from the Greek mythology. And these mythologies can be viewed as how to say, founding ideas of object relationships. And we can compare this with the Confucian idea in China and in all over Asia. The Confucian ideas and the Confucian philosophy underlines the individual as part of the family and the group, and the individual is considered to be nothing outside the group. This is very similar to our narcissistic concept of the ego. So we think that the narcissistic personality is cutting all the bonds to the objects and the group and the family and so on. And compared to this, the Confucian philosophy underlines these bonds and links with the family and the group. This is one thing, and within the Confucian philosophy, there is a hierarchy of relationships. And it starts with the parents in the family, and then the parents have to obey the boss in the company, and the boss has to obey the next higher level, and so on, up to the emperor. And the ideal personality in the Confucian philosophy is one who knows how to obey and whom to obey, and who creates a balanced view and a balanced attitude towards these different group members. While in the Western world, the individual has to also moves in groups, but has to be is seen in constant conflict with the group, and has to in some way to found its own point of thinking and behaving in difference to the others. So our ideal of the well-developed personality is a little bit heroic. So it's like the individual that goes on with its individual opinions, whatever the others say. And this is quite contradictory to the Confucian philosophy. So that's why contradicting the parents in China is very near to a taboo. So the children learn to accept and to follow the parents' rule, while in our Western philosophy, we are used to accept that starting with puberty, there is an endless quarrel with the parents. And if things develop well, after puberty, there is some agreement with the parents and everything comes to peace, but it's not a peace of children who always obey to what the parents say. So that's why what I pointed out is the Confucian philosophy, a moral philosophy, while we have more an individual philosophy, and with all what is connected in the European philosophical tasks. And of course, this influences the topic of the Oedipus conflict when it is brought to China.
We have one more question. It is, does transcultural mean fluid, culture shifting, multicultural psychoanalysis rather than a universal psychoanalysis?
I think both is true. So we have a universal psychoanalysis related to the central theoretical terms of psychoanalysis. And already Freud pointed out to this. And in the center is the acceptance of an unconscious world within all of us and also in groups and big groups. And in the same time, we have how to say local psychoanalysis, which is influenced by local habits and local cultures. So I remember a Chinese colleague staying in our institute many years ago, and she underwent psychoanalysis with a Western colleague here in Frankfurt. And once she came to me and was totally embarrassed because she went to her analyst and it was raining and she was ringing the bell and the analyst opened the door and told her that she came to the wrong date. So she didn't have the right time in her mind. And then the analyst told this to her and said so friendly to her, so we will see tomorrow. And said goodbye and closed the door. And she stood there in the rain. And she was totally embarrassed because she said this would never happen in China. This is an unbelievable behavior. A Chinese therapist never should do something like this. She was fully embarrassed. So you see by this little story that there are local habits that have to take into account when we see how psychoanalysis, in the clinical psychoanalysis, is constructed in different local areas in the world. So, for instance, in Germany, we are used shaking hands with our patients. And in Britain, this is not usual. So they don't do this. And in Asia, for instance, they also don't shake hands. So they each other and have a more distant way of meeting each other. So also the setting is sometimes how to say used in a different way. So all these details you have to discuss when you make seminars, and we have also, as Westerners, we have to question ourselves but we can only question ourselves when we are in contact with the foreign attitudes and opinions. As long as we stay in our own bubble, we don't question this.
I think we realized something about shaking hands during the pandemic when we stopped to do it, and it was missing then in the contact with the patients.
Yeah, yeah.
We have 10 minutes left, and this would be time for you to speak maybe about what you think would be important as
well,
what you want to give the people in the final.
What I've want to say in the first line is I want to convey my very, very great thanks to my experiences I could have in Asia, because it opened a new world for me, and in the same time it helped me to question the world I live in. So this was really a very enriching and learning experience for me. And still today, I have very good friends in different Asian countries, and I feel very close to them. And I'm really very thankful for everything they deliver to me. And the second thing I would say, I would encourage everyone who is developing as a psychoanalyst to go to foreign countries and to have these experiences of psychoanalysis being taught and being practiced in different cultural areas. I think, as I pointed out in the beginning, that psychoanalysis is always transcultural or intercultural, as you can say. And this is more developed if you have more these experiences with different cultures. It also helped me here in Germany when I'm coming from the east of Germany, and I only could understand through my own training analysis and my analytic experience here in West Germany how much I am how much I have been developed within the East cultural sphere, which is different from the Western culture. So for your own self-understanding and for your own self-development, it's really enriching to have these intercultural experiences. And I only can encourage everyone to do this.
So it is just a prejudice, maybe, that psychoanalysis can only be done in the native language.
Yeah, as I already said, so
you said you wished everybody to have it in his or her own language.
Yeah, but even if you have it in your own language, you have to find a foreign language for what is pre or unconscious. So it's a really when you say that psychoanalysis is a research, then this research means that we have to find proper names and sentences for what we didn't see before. And this is like learning a new language.
So there is a new language in each psychoanalytic couple.
Yeah.
Always new.
Yeah.
Newly developed.
Yeah.
Now we spoke about China, and there are other countries where we make experiences of differences. And
yes, I have been in India and in Japan, and I also met colleagues in South Korea and in Australia, and everywhere you have these experiences of differences. So Japanese also are different from the Chinese or what I experienced there. And they have a lot of common with the Chinese. So even in the writing. So, but the fascinating thing is that the psychoanalytic ideas are understood and taken in all these countries and have in some parts really an enthusiastic welcome, because it's a big step to have a tool for a deeper understanding what's going on in ourselves. And these questions, who we are and where we go, are universal questions. And psychoanalysis is one tool to give answers to these questions in a methodological way, beside other tools which are also spread all around the world. We are not the only one.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
I think we have to come to the end of this webinar. I want to thank you very much for all the content you provided and the answers you gave, and it was a great experience for me, especially because you always because you explained it as an intercultural experience and not only the transcultural experience. I think this is something we all can take with us. And you will speak about the Oedipal myth in Lisbon, and I hope that many people will come there and listen and enjoy the conference. And yes, thanks to you, Thomas. And I have to announce the next webinar. Thanks, Augustine. It's the IPA Journal Club with Diana Diamond and Frank Yeomans on June 13th, 4 p.m. London time. And yeah, I think it's a really nice event, and I hope that many people will come there and listen. And yes, thanks to everybody who listened, and a good day, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Goodbye.
I thank you also for listening and questioning and discussing. And I thank you, Ursula, for moderating.
Thank you. And thanks to Mariano and
Augustine.
And Augustine. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So, bye-bye.
Bye.